Good day, my name is Abra DeKlerk and I'm the Project Director for South Metro Connect. Sometimes making a decision can be complicated by many factors. There can also be various people involved with lots of different views of what is actually important to them. Multi-criteria analysis, or MCA, is a technique that has been developed to help with such situations. It involves working out what your choices are and identifying any factors that would be seen as being important. In reality, humans use MCA in everyday decisions. For example, say you want to purchase a new vehicle. In deciding which particular vehicle you want to purchase, you would consider aspects, or in this case criteria, such as the vehicle type, whether it's a sedan, a station wagon or a ute, the colour, the fuel consumption, maybe whether there's a hybrid option available, and perhaps lastly the price range. This process therefore could be seen as a structured approach using criteria with relative weightings, in other words which components would be more important than others, to help you make that decision. Multi-criteria assessment, or MCA, is essentially a decision support tool that helps us to analyse which options are better and which are less promising. It also provides a convenient basis to capture information and issues as they arrive, typically if it's used in a stakeholder kind of environment. In the MCA process, we are also able to undertake sensitivity testing, by example using different weightings, perhaps even different criteria, to give everybody out there an option or an opportunity to provide their input. There are 4 steps in a normal MCA process. Step 1 of this process is to identify the options. In this initial step, we identify potential options that we would like to assess. Say, for example, you have 2 roads at a junction. We might decide that there are 3 options that we want to test. The first perhaps being an at-grade intersection with stop control, the second being the same intersection but with traffic signals. And lastly, if traffic volumes are much higher, we might decide to assess a grade-separated option. The second step involves defining the criteria, in other words, those measures or aspects that you're going to use to help you make this decision. And this is where we would come up with a list of potential criteria that would help us, with that decision. We would typically use what we call a quadruple bottom line approach to that. In other words, we would come up with a balanced set of criteria covering environmental, social, engineering, economic or planning components, and lastly also governance components. So for example, let's say we're looking at a South Metro Connect option. In terms of environment, we might consider reserves and parks and other environmentally sensitive areas. Or in the social realm, we would be looking at Aboriginal and non-Indigenous heritage and perhaps even land ownership as part of that social consideration. The third step in this 4-step process is the weighting of the criteria, and this entails assigning weightings to each of the criteria, which would then be used to give an indication of their relative importance. In other words, similar to you making that decision about the vehicle that you wanted to buy, you would have some criteria that would be more important to you than others. And there are different opinions on this, and hence going back to doing a potential sensitivity analysis. The weightings assigned or agreed for the criteria would be described in simple terms from low importance through to high importance. The main advantage of this method over, say, using a weighted score or percentage is that each criteria can be weighted afresh in its own right. Now that we've identified the options, we've identified some criteria, and we've actually weighted that criteria, we're in a position to do the performance rating of these options, which is the 4th and final step in the process. This step comprises the most extensive amount of work and requires the interpolation of data, cost estimates, etc. And this step is primarily undertaken by technical experts within the realm of the defined criteria and the agreed assessment methods that we would have decided at the early stages. All the information described up to now are then used to compare the options to one another and to identify a preferred or what would be the best solution. We welcome your participation in this process and invite you to tell us what criteria typically would be important to you. Thank you very much.